Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be looking at SpaceCat. It's basically a new acronym that has sort of taken the place of Soapstone ever since the College Board redesigned the AP Language exam in 2019. So in this video, we're going to look at what the different components are. That way we can decide how best to use this in a rhetorical analysis essay. The S in SpaceCat stands for speaker, so it's important to note that when you have a speech, it's a speaker. If it's a letter, it's the writer. And if you have a novel excerpt, it's the author. But all of those serve the same purpose. Basically, you need to figure out who wrote or said what's in the passage and then what credentials they have. Now, for the AP Language exam specifically, for the rhetorical analysis question, they will give you the necessary info in the prompt itself. So they're very good about giving you the necessary biographical information, including birth and death dates or whatever you might need in order for the passage to make sense. Now, when you're looking at the multiple choice section, it's also important to read the italicized words above the passage because that will tell you where it came from, and that could clue you in on who the speaker actually is for that as well. The P stands for purpose, and I think it's really important to understand that there are a lot of layers to purpose, and so we don't want to just stop with to inform or to entertain or to instruct, because there's usually a deeper meaning. So first of all, to inform whom about what. So the whom and the what come up later in SpaceCat, but it's important to realize that these things work together. So as far as purpose, what we really need to understand is why did the speaker or writer say or write what they did? What was their overall goal? What were they trying to achieve by doing this? What is the lasting effect of it? What is the desired effect on the audience? Things like that. So purpose can be multidimensional, and technically speaking, a passage can actually have multiple purposes. In fact, we're going to talk about strategies later on in this video, but the strategies themselves can have different purposes, but the passage as a whole should have a purpose as well. The first A in SpaceCat stands for audience, and this is actually a component that I find very important, but one that I think students tend to identify but then overlook as they're actually writing their essays. And so you need to remember that a speaker tailors his or her message to his or her audience. And so they choose their words and their strategies very carefully because they have a certain goal, a certain purpose. And so when we look at a prompt, let's say it's a speech or a letter on the exam, the College Board does provide you with a clue as to who the audience is. Sometimes it's more than a clue. Sometimes they outright say it. More often than not, it's listed right there, like Gandhi's letter to Lord Irwin, that's his audience, or Madeleine Albright's commencement speech to the graduates of Mount Holyoke College, an all-women's college. So in those, we need to understand the relationship. So for instance, Gandhi is from India, which was under British control. So we have that relationship between Gandhi and Lord Irwin there. And when you read the passage and you realize what he's asking for / demanding, you realize the relationship between the two. And then you could think about Madeleine Albright, female speaker. She's a politician speaking to an all-girls college right as they're graduating and about to go off into the real world. And so her message in that speech is tailored to her audience. So those choices matter because of who the audience is. Even in the Abigail Adams letter to her son, it's an audience of one. She's only writing to one person, her son, but there's a mother-son relationship there. So it's really important to realize not only who the audience is, but how that person might impact the speaker's message. Now, sometimes the audience isn't outright stated in the prompt itself. For instance, I'm thinking of the Louvre passage in which it was an excerpt from his novel. If you look at the passage, you realize that there is a section where he's using the word we, and presumably we is the people of his generation. And so that could be part of his audience. And based on the anecdote earlier in the passage, you could argue that perhaps he's also speaking to parents. And so sometimes the audience isn't necessarily told to you, but based on how the passage is excerpted, you can think about who the audience actually is. And you want to try, if possible, to be a bit more specific with the term audience. You don't want to just say like society or people in general, if you can be more specific than that. But audience is very important because the speaker makes choices in order to persuade the audience. With the acronym SOAPstone, one of the S's stood for subject. Now, we don't have subject in Space Cat, but we do have context. So subject is what the person is speaking about. Context is a little bit more broad and therefore, in some sense, a bit more helpful. So you've heard of the term historical context. So think about the time period in which this passage is from. So what was going on at the time? For instance, like Abigail Adams, we know that she was a first lady, but she wasn't necessarily the first lady when she wrote this letter. But in the letter itself, it references the American Revolution. So we're able to kind of realize the historical context of a lot of these passages just by what the passage says. The Gandhi letter, for instance, if you didn't necessarily know exactly when India was under British control, you would figure that out from the letter as well. So context is something that you need to consider because oftentimes these documents are in some way a response to what is happening either locally or nationally or personally at the time that it's being written. So context helps you understand some of the bigger social implications of the piece. Next up is exigence. So this is kind of like occasion if you're familiar with Soapstone. They're not exactly the same thing, but to be honest, I think they're kind of similar, or at least I think students interpret them rather similarly. So if you've never heard of exigence, this is a term to remember, especially if you're currently in AP Lang, because some of the questions on AP Classroom actually ask what the exigence of the piece is, and it's a multiple choice thing. So exigence is basically the catalyst. It's what prompts or compels the speaker to speak or the writer to write. And so I say there's a little bit of overlap with occasion because, for instance, if it's a commencement speech, presumably it was the graduation ceremony that compelled them to speak. But you also want to take into consideration the audience and the context and how they're tailoring their message to those things. So exigence is just kind of like the thing, the event, the whatever that gets it all started. So that's important because you want to know why they're writing or speaking in the first place. The second C stands for choices. And so if you've heard of rhetorical strategies, that's basically what we're talking about here, except I guess technically speaking, rhetorical choices is even broader of a term. So a rhetorical strategy is a rhetorical choice, but not every single rhetorical choice is a strategy. So for instance, when people use humor or flattery, that might be a choice that they're making. You could think of it as a strategy as well, but I think the word choices opens up more possibilities for students to analyze. So I've listed some common strategies / choices here. These are ones that I think tend to come up more frequently than others. So it's things like juxtaposition and anecdote. Notice that I'm not listing things like asyndeton or synecdoche or any of those that sound really fancy, because when you name drop those in an essay, it doesn't actually make you sound any smarter. And sometimes just because you know it's there doesn't mean you can analyze it well. So I tend to encourage students to just kind of like stick to the ones that they can analyze well. And even though they might seem simpler, it's perfectly okay. And another thing is you want to make sure that you're not necessarily just only using the strategy name. Like for instance, you can use juxtaposition as a verb, like he juxtaposes X and Y. So you want to be really specific. If you're talking about an anecdote, tell what the anecdote is about. If you're talking about imagery, you might want to work in maybe like diction or tone as well. So a lot of strategies and choices go together. And so it's not necessarily that you're writing about one choice per paragraph. Sometimes it's more than one choice working together to create this message. The second A stands for appeals. Now, you've probably heard of logos, ethos, and pathos, but there are other types of appeals. My caution with the appeals is that while there's probably at least one appeal in everything that you read, you want to make sure that you're actually examining like why something is logical or why something is credible. Like, why does the speaker need to use logic here? And so oftentimes students can identify when something is logical or credible or when it's an appeal to emotion, but they don't develop the analysis enough. So for instance, if you're going to say pathos, it would sound much better to just say the author appeals to emotion. And then my correction then would be which emotion. So instead of saying the author uses pathos, it would sound much better to say the author appeals to nostalgia. Okay. And then you're starting to get into the audience connection there. Like, why does the author use this appeal? So appeals can be very helpful, but you want to make sure that you're actually examining the implications of that appeal. Lastly, we have tone. Now, tone is something that is created by word choice. So every passage that you read is going to have a tone. Now, for my own students, I encourage them not to write an entire paragraph about tone because tone is often dictated by the other choices that the author is making. So tone can be brought up a lot more subtly than I think some students initially realize. So for instance, when describing the speech, you could say the riveting yet frightening speech or something like that. So you want to use like two different words there. That's one way to incorporate it. So notice that I didn't say the author uses a riveting tone or anything like that. And then you can also use it, like, for instance, if you're talking about satire, if you say the author sarcastically references or something like that, it's implied that like sarcastic is the tone in that case. So you can actually talk about tone without using the word tone. And I think that leads for more sophistication in your writing. Not that you're going to automatically earn the sophistication point, but it makes your writing sound a little bit more advanced. And so tone can be worked in different ways. So you want to look for a tone shift. You want to look for the relationship between a particular strategy and the tone it's creating. But oftentimes tone is not something that we examine in isolation, especially if we're trying to write a paragraph about it. Usually you can work tone into the other paragraphs that you've written. And looking at the acronym of SPACE-CAT as a whole, it's clear that there are multiple components that one needs to consider when doing a rhetorical analysis. So it's not that any of these things are new in 2019, but rather this is a new way to present it to students in hopes that it will help broaden your understanding of the text and lead to deeper analysis.